All right, well, good morning. It's good to be with you, honest to goodness, and greetings from the seminary. Gary preached for it, prayed for it. I appreciate it. I teach at the seminary. We had rather a remarkably good week because this week we had our accrediting team in. I don't know how much you know about accrediting, but it can be a pain. But our accrediting team, they came on Monday. We're going to be there for Tuesday and all day Wednesday. And Tuesday afternoon, they came to the president and the pastor and said, you know what, we're so happy with what's going around here, we're just going to go home. So they left a day early and told us we were going to get our 10 years. So God was good. A lot of work went into it, but we're thrilled. Now, it is the Easter season, and you know, we don't have a lot of deliberate. It's interesting. God, King Yahweh, created a religious calendar for his kingdom in the Old Testament, and it was just a regular cycle of feasts where you would stop and pretty much stop everything you were doing and focus on God's goodness and so on. We don't have that built in. What we have in our culture is just kind of the vestiges of a couple of, Christmas and Easter, what's left of it. But I think it's a healthy thing to, certainly at this season of the year, focus more specifically, and I'd like to do that just a little bit. You have some notes. Yeah, good. I know you can't read that, but we might be able to read the other page a little bit, but it's not important. I'm more after the scriptures. But let me just say this, and Gary, I meant to ask you if this was okay, but if not, straighten them out next week. But listen, and I hope there's not overmuch hubris in this. Perhaps there is, but I have a website. I'd say it's a Dropbox where there's a lot of material relative to the life of Jesus, and it's right there. If you want to take a picture of that, and I was gonna put on. I just made a little, so they're here. Yeah, we'll leave them here, and you can. Now, I'm not going to spend any time with it, but safe to say that that'll take you. Technology does it. Oh, so there. It'll take you to a Dropbox, and it's just stuff. Listen, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that's better than what's there, but I can't give somebody else's stuff away. So I can give my stuff away. So they're notes. They're the notes we use in the seminary. There are some audio sessions. There's a series that I did, and I didn't know there was such a thing as Facebook Live, but when we were in the early days of our corporate insanity, my daughter said to me, you should, introduce me to it. And so I just walked through, what else did you have to do, for heaven's sakes? Remember those early days? And walked through. As a matter of fact, when we got to the week of the Passion, we were celebrating Easter week each day. I just walked through what happened on that day, and so on. So it's there, and any use you can put it to, I'd be, please help yourself. But at any rate, I do give you, and you can perhaps see this on your phone, but it is fascinating that, as you know, every one of the four Gospels is deliberately selective, right? None of them is or claims to be an exhaustive telling of the life of Jesus, and God gave us those four in order to provide us a fourfold eyewitness testimony to the life, the most important life ever lived, the life of our Savior on the earth. And but it's interesting. Every one of those four. Have you ever noticed, by the way? Have you ever noticed that a lot of the books of the Bible are about the same length, like Matthew, John, Acts, Luke, the 5 books? You know why that is? Anybody? There was a standard length of a scroll, and you simply, it became impossible to handle. So there's a very standard length, outside length of a scroll, which is to say that every one of the gospel writers, every one of the Bible, that writes a full scroll, knows that he has space limitations. So he's got to select, and this is under the ministry of the Spirit of God that we call inspiration, but he's got to be selective. And it's just fascinating, to me anyway, it's instructive, that although every one of the four Gospels is very selective as to what he does record, each of them gives almost exactly 40% of his space to the last week of Jesus' life. So about 2/5 of each of the Gospels is the last 8 8-day week. I always say it's an 8-day week or we wouldn't be here this morning, right? But so it starts on Sunday when Jesus comes into Jerusalem and presents himself as Messiah, and all the way through, of course, the following Sunday when he comes alive out of a tomb. By the way, Gary, I don't know. Are you familiar with the fact that during the early Byzantine period, when churches began to be built for the first 300 years of church history, there weren't physical churches because they were under Rome and they were persecuted, but then they began to build churches, and they were always octagonal, 8-sided. Are you familiar with that? They're called a martyr's church. And I just learned this a while ago. The reason is because that 8 side represents the 8th day. So these are martyrs, but they have the hope of that 8th day, the resurrection day. But at any rate, the point is that, and I think it's so, I don't know, I think it's certainly worth your time to really get to know, well, to finish the thought, the fact that about 2/5 of each of the 4 Gospels is given over to the last week of Jesus' life. I always say that suggests there are 2 conclusions we can draw from that. Number one is we can reconstruct the last week of Jesus with a detail and specificity that we can't bring to any other period of his life, because you've got almost hour by hour. So you really can reconstruct that week. And secondly, it would suggest to me that God really wants us to know that week. And so there are some materials there. This chart, I'm not going to spend any time with it, but it's just an overview of the 8 days. But I want to back up and talk about 3 times. Well, let me just get into it. There are 3 times in the Gospel of John where Jesus uses the phrase, "if I be lifted up." Now, can you rehearse them? I can, because I spent time with this. But now in John chapter 3, can you finish this? As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, excuse me, even so, what's the next word? Now, I grew up in a King James, so it'll yeah, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. That's talking to Nicodemus. As Moses lifted up the serpent, even so must. Then in John chapter 8, as a matter of fact, I have this. I can take you here. See if this, in John chapter 8 and verse, I have them on your sheet as well, I guess. Pardon? So in John 8:28, all right, time out here. I'm just going to do something here. In John 8:28, he says, when you, and by the way, the context, this is the Feast of Tabernacles, 6 months before Jesus dies. And he has come to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. And his enemies, by now, his enemies who are seeking to put him to death, primarily the Pharisees, they insist that you're an imposter, you're not speaking for the Lord, you're destroying the law. And so he says, when you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he and that I do nothing of myself. He claims to speak from the Father, to reveal the Father, to be the Word of the Father, and they resist him. When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know. And then the next one, and the one that we read this morning already, is in John chapter 12, and verse, 31, I think. Now, and this one is fascinating, and I have this on your sheet of notes, but in John 12, he says, and again, okay, this is on Tuesday of the Passion Week. So now the triumphal entry happened on Sunday. Yesterday, he cleansed the temple and possessed it. And now he's been teaching, and the synoptics go through so carefully how each of his enemies, that is, first of all, the Sadducees, then the Pharisees, then the Sadducees, had tried to catch him in his words. So it's been an exciting day. Jesus has put them to silence. Remember all this again and again. And then he's, by the way, according to Matthew, he is doing miracles this whole time. That always puts a little different light on. In other words, on Tuesday of the Passion Week, yesterday he cleansed the temple for the second time in his ministry. Now he comes back and he begins to teach, and Mark says that he would not so much as allow a man to carry a vessel of water across the temple courts. Now, those temple courts are 36 acres, 3 football fields. And it's a huge area, and it's still there today, by the way. That airspace is exactly what it was in Jesus' day. We call it the Temple Mount today. But the point is that Malachi says explicitly that the Messiah, the messenger of the new covenant, will come suddenly to his temple. And every Jew understood that Messiah would rule from the temple. And so there's such drama. And what I was going to say is, throughout the day, people were coming to him, and he was healing them. So, and yet his enemies, and by the way, his enemies, both Sadducees, because you see, they control the temple, and now Jesus has taken that control away from them for 2 days, and the Pharisees. And the Pharisees control the synagogues, and they've been mad at him for years because he's been going from synagogue to synagogue. And so when Jesus, when he rode into the city of Jerusalem several weeks ago, maybe just 2 or 3 weeks ago, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And after he did that, the Sanhedrinists, the leaders of the Jews, came together, John 11, verse 53, and determined to put him to death. And then in verse 57 of John 11, it says that they put out a notice that if anybody knew where he was, they were to alert them so he could be arrested. So Jesus is a fugitive, and in the most dramatic, real sense after the raising of Lazarus. But now he rides into the city of Jerusalem. The whole city throws their garment down and welcomes him as king. And then on Monday he comes in and possesses the temple. And I like to say that Jesus never ever behaved so messianically as when he controlled the temple for 2 days and put his enemies to silence, and he's healing people who are coming to him. But in the midst of that, there's this marvelously poignant scene that I'd like to talk about where Jesus is gripped with the terror of his death, and he prays, and the Father speaks aloud. But then if you go down to verse, here it is right here in verse 32, he says, I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. Now, here's the thing, folks. I've heard this preached as if the idea is if we honor him, we sing and honor him, we lift him up. That's not what it means. I'm sorry. I mean, it's a good thing to lift him up in that fashion, but that's not what this is talking about, and I know that because John tells us in the next verse, and it is such a help. He says, this he said, signifying by what death, what specific sort of death he would die. Now, Jesus came to offer himself to the Jewish people, that generation of Jews. The Old Testament prophesied, and we have the record that in fact, that generation of Jews rejected him, especially the leaders. And we well might have expected Jesus to die in a standard Jewish way by being stoned to death. But Jesus is explicit that it is necessary that he die by being lifted up. And what gives real absolute credibility to that is John 18. You have this again on your notes if you have them out, but John 18 and verse 28. And again, just to set the scene, this is Jesus before the no, it's a little further along. Hold on here, I'm not finding it. Right there. All right, so let me set the scene here. This is Jesus before Pilate. He was arrested. Last night, he kept the Passover with his disciples on an upper hill, in an upper room on the western hill. Then he made his way down to Gethsemane and had that season of gut-wrenching prayer. And now as he emerges from that brief season of prayer with his Father, here comes Judas and the Sanhedrin, the soldiers, and Jesus is arrested. It's about 4:30 he's arrested late at night. He's going to be taken to the Jewish authorities. And their issue is that they don't have an indictment. They want this man dead. They know, for reasons we're going to talk about in a minute, that they can't do it themselves. They need the Roman authorities to do the dirty work. and they have it all set up, and there's an arrangement for a trial before Pontius Pilate, at about 4:30 in the morning. So sure enough, he is taken to the Sanhedrinists. They finally get him to acknowledge. Let me just tell you what's at stake here. You know, one of the dynamics of Jesus, of the ministry that we have recorded, and that is, I think, easy to overlook. And let me just stop and say this in the middle of my stopping. Folks, take very seriously, bow the knee to what the Bible says about the reality of Jesus' humanity. I warn people all the time. I may have done it here, I can't remember, but I warn people all the time against what I call the Clark Kent approach to Christology. You know where I'm headed with that? The point is, there never was a Clark Kent. That was Superman pretending, right? Very, very deliberately perpetuating the illusion that he was Clark Kent. And I think it's easy to, it's a tendency, and it's so crippling, to read the Gospels as if Jesus is just God pretending to be man, perpetuating the illusion that he's man. But he doesn't live under the limitations, and so his temptations are not real, they're pretend. No, they're real. And one of the dynamics that arises out of that I take delight in the gospel record, is that Jesus told his disciples in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 16 that they had to be as wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And I love that thing. And the word that he uses for wise there is not the standard skillful living word that you have in the Old Testament wisdom literature and so on. It's a word that means clever, resourceful. I like to say, you could say scheming, as long as you acknowledge the second part of the command, and that is harmless as doves. And Jesus was that perfectly. That's what he's saying in Matthew 10:16. The verse I just quoted is where he is sending out the 12 in Matthew chapter 10. But he says, you're going in my name, and you have to represent who I am. And for that reason, you need to be wise, clever, resourceful. And I always like to say that what that means is we have no right to be careless with whatever set of spiritual resources God gives us. We're under command to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Well, coming back to it, Jesus was that. And what happened is, when Jesus was arrested and brought before the Sanhedrin in the middle of the night, it's about midnight, and the problem, their issue is that they have Pilate ready to sit in judgment on this man, Jesus, but they don't have an indictment because they want to claim that he claims to be Messiah King. But Jesus was so clever, and you trace this in the Gospels, it's unmistakable. He was so clever that he never used the word Messiah of himself. Now, what he did is take to himself all sorts of Old Testament passages and titles and so on that anybody would understand, any Jew would understand he was claiming to be Messiah. But he knew if he simply said, I am Messiah, above all things means king, and Rome has no room for pretender kings, right? So Jesus would facilitate his enemies' attempts to kill him if he were to just say, I am Messiah. So he takes, what is Jesus' favorite title of himself, 81 for himself? 81 times. What is it? Son of Man. I think that's what he said. Good job. I don't hear so well. No, it is. 81 times he refers to himself as Son of Man. Why? Well, that's right out of Daniel 7. Daniel has a vision. He sees 4 beasts, and then the Ancient of Days comes and takes his throne, and one like unto a Son of Man comes and takes the throne next to him, and therefore is dispatched to establish a 5th world kingdom, and that's Messiah. Any Jewish person is going to know that when Jesus claims to be Son of Man, he is claimed to be Messiah. On the other hand, if you go to the Roman authorities, you go to Pilate, and you say, you're in trouble here, this guy claims to be the Son of Man, what's Pilate going to say? Me too. What are you talking about, for heaven's sakes? So the fact is that Jesus was so clever, so circumspect, that the Sanhedrinists spent the night trying to find somebody who could say, I heard him make the claim that he is Messiah, and he couldn't find him. And so finally Caiaphas, remember, puts him under oath, and tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of God? And Jesus says, I am. Now the Sanhedrin has got him. It's about 4:30 in the morning, and they Pilate, and that's the scene right here. They bring him just around to the western side of the city. Beautiful place. You can go there and stand exactly where Jesus was tried before Pilate, I swear. I mean, it's, and nobody knows it's there. I mean, it was an archaeologist by the name of Shimon Gibson has dug it out, but anyway, it's so right there on the western side of the city, there's a gate system going into Herod's palace inside the walled city of the first century, and it was set up as a court, there was a bema seat there. There's physical archaeological evidence that it was a bema seat there, a judgment seat. So he's brought to Pilate, and it's about 4:30 in the morning, and Pilate says, what's the charge? And they say, look, now, by the way, they had their agents, the Sanhedrinists had sent their agents undoubtedly, and they'd worked this out, and all they wanted Pilate to do was condemn him, for heaven's sake. Who needs a real trial? So Pilate says, what's the charge? And they say, look, if he weren't a malefactor, we wouldn't have brought him to you. And Pilate said, well, I'm not going to, you go do it yourself then, if you're not going to even give me the charge, for heaven's sakes. And they say, and here it is right here in, therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put him to death. But this is what I want to say. The Jews, and that means the leadership. It's a very small group. It's 4:30 in the morning. The Jews said to him, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death, in order that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Now, I'd love to go further with that, but for sake of time, let me just take you to the notes that you have, because I know this is small. You can probably see it there. But I have here a list of I call relevant dynamics. I'm going to talk through these very, very quickly. But it's so important to understand. And it's very recoverable. There's no real question about any of this. But I think it's important to spend the time to understand the historical. By the way, we believe and we teach and insist upon at the seminary, and your pastor believes it, in grammatical historical interpretation. That means you gotta understand especially these narrative sections in terms of their historical setting. And there's so much drama and so many dynamics. But let me just very quickly, and I'm going to go through the list. Number one is Rome's non-negotiable demand, and that is that the governor, whoever the governor is, Rome had this vast empire, this ribbon around the Mediterranean Sea from India to Britain at one time, and they had divided it all up into these governing regions. And over each region there was some senior officer, and he might be called a procurator, might be called a prefect, as well, a tetrarch, and so on. They had all sorts of names, but whatever his title and however big his domain, every Roman officer had these two responsibilities. Number one, what does government do best? Collect the taxes. I like to tell people that, this is a long time ago. It was a different world, so it's hard for us to get in touch with it. But the fact is that the Roman Empire had spent itself into abject poverty on the most foolish, self-serving foolishness, and they couldn't think of anything to do about it except to tax its citizens more highly. I know it's hard for us to get in touch with that, but work at it. I'm being facetious. Okay, so but the point is, you got two responsibilities. Number one, collect the taxes. Number two, keep the peace, and by peace I mean pax. Remember the phrase Pax Romana? We think of peace, it's kind of a ironic, everybody getting along. They don't care about that. It's a heavy-handed absence of violence. That's all they don't want to have. They've got a huge army. It is stretched entirely beyond its capacity. They have overseen, because each province was responsible for this remarkable engineering effort called the Roman road system. All of that's there for is so they can get their army with all of its equipment from one place to another quickly. That's what that's all about. But the point is that they don't want to have, and there's no large contingency of forces in Jerusalem. There is in Alexandria, there is in Damascus, but they don't want to have to be bringing. So the point is that as a Roman governor, whoever that Roman governor, here it's Pilate, your primary responsibility is keep the peace. In other words, if they have to bring soldiers in for some sort of riot or upheaval, then they're going to put that down. Then they're going to find out who's behind it, and heads are going to roll. That's a huge dynamic. Secondly, I say there, Jesus popular. I say apparent because on Sunday he rides into the city, and the whole city explodes in happy welcome. But by Friday, they're going to be calling for his crucifixion. Now, we could talk a lot about that, but the point is that if you are either a Roman or a Jewish leader, in other words, the Pilate and the government there, and then the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership, you have every reason to believe. Well, here's the thing. We're talking, well, let's just think about this week. Like I say, on Sunday, Jesus rode into town. The whole place exploded in happy, welcomed him as king, by the way. And then on Monday, he took control of the temple, and the masses of tens and hundreds of thousands of people who were there that week for Passover are cheering him and so on. So my point is that the leaders, both Jewish and Roman, have Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday ringing in their ears, and they have every reason to believe that if Jesus is arrested, certainly if they just grab him and take him out and put him to death like they did Stephen was a nobody. They could get away with that. But Jesus is so popular, they have every reason to believe that if they arrest him, there's going to be a riot. And if there's a riot, their heads are going to roll. Does that make sense to you? So that's kind of the balance here. Thirdly, I say and that's the, that therefore, this is the, I won't go any further with it, but this is the plan. This is the master plan on the part of the unbelieving Jewish leadership. They are desperate to see him dead. They were angry after the raising of Lazarus, but now he has ridden into town as king. He has seized the temple, and they are desperate, but they know that they can't do it themselves, the Jewish leadership. And so on Tuesday night, Judas sneaked off to a hill on the south of Jerusalem called the Hill of Evil Counsel to this day. That's the name of that hill, because that's where Caiaphas lived, and that's where Judas went on Tuesday night to make the bargain. And remember, what was Judas hired to do? He was hired to help them arrest Jesus in the absence of the multitude. That's Luke 22, verse 6. It could not be more explicit. And it's not like he's going to follow him around, and send up a flare or something when he's by himself. They know that next time he's going to be in the absence of the multitude is at the Passover. Because Passover on Thursday, he has to go inside. It'll just be him and the apostles. And so a huge plan is put in place to get Jesus, this is all important, arrested, tried, sentenced, and on his way to execution, here's the big point, while the city sleeps. All of this has to be done under cover of night. And the whole plan is to get Jesus already on his way to crucifixion by the Romans by the time the city wakes up. And therefore, what are you going to do? Does that make sense to you? And it's carefully contrived. So I'm going to leave it at that. So my point is simply this, that Jesus 3 times says, when I am lifted, then you'll know. If I am lifted up, then I will draw people. And John tells us explicitly that he is talking about the sort of death he would die, and that is crucifixion. And I'd like to walk you through it. But in point of fact, and I think it's a blessedness to realize that Jesus contrived. He ordered his steps in such a way as to make sure he would be turned over to the Romans and die by crucifixion. And because he has said, it is imperative that I die. And it's interesting, by the way. All right. Let me get to my peroration, as it were. Why? Why was it important that he die? And I have on your sheet, I think it's important in this regard to understand that crucifixion, the Roman, they had refined crucifixion, official crucifixion. A man is accused of sedition. You got to understand, Rome is horribly paranoid about sedition, about pretender kings, right? At this expansive empire, a lot of those kingdoms they could still remember when they were running their own, minting their own coins and making their own treaties and so on, but now they're under the heel of Rome, and it's a huge empire, and they will not tolerate pretender kings, sedition. They have and the one place on earth, on the Roman Empire, where they had more seditious activity than there was Jerusalem and Israel. And so, but the point is that Rome had refined this method of execution by crucifixion. And if sometimes, for instance, when Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, they were crucifying people just in every sort of fashion, and it was awful. But if it's an official execution by reason of sedition, Rome demanded, number one, very quickly, I'm not going to spend any time, it had to be cruel, had to be unspeakably cruel. I'm not going to spend time with it. It's ugly. It's gut-wrenching, as a matter of fact. But the point is that crucifixion was not primarily about executing the seditionist. It was about putting down the sedition and making sure that whatever, to whatever degree, seditious thoughts were simmering in your soul spirit, it was put to rest when you saw what happened. That makes sense to you? So it had to be cruel, had to be public, had to be near a main gate. Main gate's a choke point, so you got to go in there. I always say you might, squeeze over against the yonder wall and take your skirts and wrap it around a kid's ears and hustle through and so on, but you're going to have to make your way through that gate. And here's that poor wretch hanging there, usually 2 or 3 days is the standard, and in just unspeakable terror. I won't go any further with it. It had to be lingering. They wanted it to go on for several days. That's why there was always an apparatus. Once you're affixed to a cross, your rib just sits in on your breathing apparatus, and you can't breathe without hoisting yourself up. That's why if you want to hasten his death, you break his legs, because every breath you take, you can't fall asleep, you can't fall into a coma, you'll gag to death. So, at any rate, but more than anything else, and this is where I'm taking you, Rome insisted that the crucifixion be, I like to say, publicly certifiable, that there be some means by which his physical death was demonstrated, physically, visibly, palpably demonstrated on the cross. And the reason was because Rome would not tolerate the possibility that the rumor would get out that somehow this poor seditionist had survived and the sedition could go on. So he had to be demonstrated, and it's interesting in this regard, and I got to be done, but it's interesting in this regard. I give you this verse. Matter of fact, I'm going to take you there in John 19, because in the telling of the crucifixion in John 19, John stops and here it is right here. This oath right here, verse 35. Now think about this. This is kind of stunning, because what's at stake is this. I have it in yellow. But it says, again, they came out, they saw he was already dead, they didn't break his legs, in fulfillment, by the way, of the prophecy that not one bone be broken. But then it says, one of the soldiers pierced his side, and immediately blood and water came out. That means it's evidence of physical death. And then John says, and he who has seen has testified, his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth so that you may believe. In other words, he puts himself under self-imposed oath, and he puts his hand on the Bible. I swear to him, I'm telling the truth, and nothing but the truth. Blood and water came out. Now, here's the point. Why was it that, I already told you why it was that the matter of fact, I've read where, by the way, there were 4 soldiers assigned to every crucifixion, every individual, every victim. And if they inadvertently took the body off the cross, and on the ground there was the last hint of physical life, just the flutter of an eyelid, and then the man died, and all 4 soldiers were put in a cross. That's how serious Rome was that he die on the cross, physical death. All right, let me just draw it to a close here. Why? Folks, it's interesting. Do you remember? Of course you do. In John 11, when Jesus went to raise Lazarus from the dead, he waited 2 days and contrived to show up on the 4th day. And when he went out to the tomb and said, roll the stone away, Martha said, no, no, he stinks. And he did stink. Well, why did Jesus wait until the 4th day? I think it's because, you see, the reality of the raising of Lazarus is entirely dependent upon the reality of his death. And you can't counterfeit the kind of death stench that's going to come rolling out of that tomb. So in the case of Lazarus, God contrived to prove true the reality of his death by leaving him in that tomb for 4 days so that the death stench. That makes sense to you? With Jesus, he dies by being lifted up, and therefore, and by the way, you didn't have to be there that afternoon and see the blood and water. If you know anything about the Roman Empire, and you hear that this Nazarene was crucified, was raised on a cross, and died by Roman crucifixion, you know beyond of a shadow of doubt, he did not come off that cross until he was dead. Does that make sense? By the same token, the reality of Jesus' resurrection is entirely a function of the reality of his death. And therefore, it was imperative that he be lifted up so that nobody could deny that man genuinely died. And therefore, when he showed himself alive by many infallible proofs for those 40 days, there was no denying that this man is what he claimed. He was declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead. Romans 1:4. But the testimony of the resurrection is dependent upon the reality of his death, and it was important that he be lifted up in order to be no mistake about that. All right, Gary, you want to come and